And the man who has followed and documented so much of the history of the Black press is our next guest, and that is Dr. Clint Wilson. Dr. Wilson, welcome to WIN TV.
Well, thank you. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. I am sitting here really excited to read your most recent book, Whether the Black Press, Glorious Past, Uncertain Future. But this is the most recent. Tell us about why you think it's important for us to acknowledge 195 years of Black press history, and maybe some of the highlights that you have written about in several of the books that you've done.
Well, first of all, I'd like to kind of acknowledge the relationship, as you've mentioned, between the Black press and the Black church. And so it's very appropriate that we would have members of the clergy on today's program. Freedom's Journal, as you mentioned, started on March 16th, 1827. We're just 2 days removed from the 195th anniversary. But I would like to call your attention to the fact that the very first issue of Freedom's Journal carried a byline under the heading Freedom's Journal. And it was a quotation taken from the Bible. And that motto, if you will, of Freedom's Journal was taken from Proverbs 14, verse 34. Righteousness exalteth a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. And so that is an appropriate theme for us to consider when we look at the Black press, because it tells us that the Black press was founded as a spiritual institution. One of the two founding editors, Samuel Cornish, was in fact a clergyman. And among the several individuals who formed a committee to discuss the founding of the paper, at least 4 or 5 of them were clergymen. So that has been intertwined with the Black press from the beginning, that this is a cause, as they wrote, for the common good of all people of African descent. They were not only concerned about the discriminatory issues that they confronted as free Black men, but they were also concerned about those who were enslaved. And that tradition, that relationship exists to this day, as we're just now talking about. There's a symbiotic relationship between the Black press and the church that you don't find in the so-called mainstream press. And that sets us apart. This is why the Black press will always be with us as long as injustice exists for Black people in this country.
One of the things that date, 1827, proves, this is what, 40, almost 40 years before, before the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln.
Yes.
There's this belief that while many Black people were not allowed to learn how to read and write, there was still a literate Black community. Can you talk a little bit about that, and who was reading and supporting those Black newspapers?
Well, Black people themselves. There were collections taken up, the early papers, starting with Freedom's Journal. We must understand, first of all, that although Freedom's Journal was published from New York City, it was a regional paper. It was distributed throughout the Eastern Seaboard. And the gentlemen who came together to found it came from different states along the Eastern Seaboard. And they had committed themselves, again, through the church, to distribute the papers as agent, throughout. And in fact, we should also note that even though there are not very many literate Black people among the enslaved population, they were very, very much aware of Freedom's Journal and the efforts it was undertaking. So that's very important for us to understand uh, in terms of, uh, the Black press has always had struggles maintaining financial solvency. So these gentlemen put their own money into it, but also there were contributions, out of pocket. So in terms of literacy, um, it's important or interesting to note that oftentimes the church was the place to get this information. So, for example, if there was a Black newspaper in Buffalo, New York, or um, somewhere else on the Eastern Seaboard, right after church services, someone might get up and read the contents to the congregation. This
Mm.
was like almost like an ancillary effort to the church services. So that intertwining relationship between the two um, have been very important. The last thing I'd say about that is that exists to this day. Many of the uh, publishers in today's Black press are people who are from the clergy. Um, Most Black newspapers have a substantial religious section, and it is the essence, it's the heart, in much the same way as we talk about the gentleman earlier who were talking about how um, Black people come together um, to communicate, express uh, their opposition to some of the laws and social injustices. Uh, this can't be done without instruments like the Informer and others across the country to keep people informed. And while I'm rambling, let me uh, let me let you understand that the Black press uh, today uh, still serves that purpose uh, to unify the community. It is a place where people can come together and express themselves. And I know that later on we might talk a little bit about uh, miscommunication and what should we say, alternative facts, etc. And one of the things that we need to understand is that this is not new. Back in the
Mm.
Reconstruction era, there were papers published by uh, the white community, and they would pass themselves off as Black papers by getting someone to kind of front as the editor. But
Mm.
all of the editorial principles and the direction of the articles were strictly motivated towards the interest of the people with money who were behind it. So uh, we've always had to fight the notion of misinformation,
Information.
miscommunication.
Yeah, I would, before we move on to, current times, I do want to ask you, since we're in Women's History Month, you are talking to a woman
Yes,
publisher, but I want to reflect on the first,
yes.
Marianne Shad
Yeah,
Carey,
Jerry,
rather.
yes.
Yeah, Shad Carey, who had a presence here in Washington, D.C., as a
That's
matter of
right.
fact. But can you talk a little bit about her and her being a first?
Well, um, Mary Ann Shad Carey was one of the first persons to get her law degree, uh, women, I should say. She went to Howard, and she um, was part of the movement early on. They were involved, her and her family were involved in Underground Railroad activities and trying to um, address issues of inequality, and they were very much under threat. So they moved to Canada. And so while in Canada, it was there that she and her family started a black newspaper. And so her career um, from that point on was very much um, uh, dedicated to the black press and the causes of the African American community.
Yeah, I think it's always good. We always talk about, those two men, but we always kind of leave her out. Of course, we always remember Ida B. Wells,
Ida
who
B.
is,
Wells, yes,
who's one of our heroes of the
mhm,
Black press, and
right.
there are so many. But going now to where we are today, because it's interesting. Your book talked about glorious past, uncertain future, and
Mhm.
when you wrote that title, what were you thinking about the uncertain future? How do you define that?
That is that the black press has faced many challenges over the years. Um, Financial, of course, but also, some papers have been destroyed by, uh, the communities in which they exist. And that happened to Ida B. Wells in Memphis. She barely escaped with her life. Um, and in fact, it was the lynching of one of the prominent businessmen in Memphis uh, who had a very successful business, and there were those who were jealous. I guess is the only way I can put it. And and much as you saw in Tulsa and other places, they just decided they would run him out of town, and they lynched him. And that's what set her off on this crusade against lynching. So
And it's
this,
funny, after all
mhm,
these years, I hate to cut you off, Dr. Wilson, but it's
yeah,
just what, last week we finally
mhm,
had the anti-lynching bill passed
yes,
by the House and signed by President Biden. That's what, been over 100
oh,
years now?
oh, yes, yes, very slow, and I'm always appalled. I remember when I met uh, John Hope Franklin, and he was talking about I didn't even know he was from Tulsa at that point, and that his family was very much a victim of that. And yet, there are people who live, talking about communication, there are people who live in Tulsa today, even black people, who have no knowledge of that, massacre that took place, 100 years ago.
Mm.
How can that be? There's a communications issue. And that again speaks to, as one of your previous guests said, speaks to the whole notion of who's telling the story. And it's important that we tell our own story. But back to your original question, which is the matter of uh, uh, the uncertain future, and that has to do with, again, the economic thing. It is very difficult, and you would know this better than most. Very difficult in today's economic environment with a changing scenario of communications media. You've got social media out there spreading their thing, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, all those kinds of things, um, with varying degrees of accuracy and truth. Um, and yet, that as media have moved into becoming a more uh, technological phenomenon, which necessitates heavy investments in new technology, and to have trained staff who can navigate those forums. The black press has found it generally difficult to keep up that pace, and so I'm proud of the fact that there have been a number of major black newspapers who have gone online, who are doing social services things digitally. They're having forums um, on Zoom and those kinds of things, and things that deal with health and welfare and employment and education. Uh, so the challenge for the black press is to, frankly, to kind of follow the informer, to uh, find ways to get the message out, and and the news publications who have been successful are the ones who, again, are doing it for the common good. That's what the Freedom's Journal is all about, for the common good. And if you have that as your purpose, and not economic reward,
Hmm.
um, but if you have that as your purpose, you will succeed, because there will always be a need for the black press, as has been mentioned. I'm one of them. They're back in my 20s. I thought, well, won't be a need for this. I worked at that time for the Los Angeles Sentinel. And there were people around me who thought, well, Dr. King is on the march and all these advances are being made, voting rights acts, et cetera. And, in a matter of time, the black press will go out of business. In fact, there was an NMPA meeting in the 1940s, which had that as the main theme. Is it our job to put ourselves out of business? Just think
Wow.
about that.
Wow. Wow.
You
That's
know,
amazing.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
2022. There's nowhere near that kind of an outlook for us. So that's what I mean. We have a glorious past, and we'll have a glorious future as long as we kind of stay abreast of the technology.
So the one thing
So
that I found that's been great, I mean, you were a college professor. You taught at
Mhm.
Howard. You taught many students at Howard.
Mhm.
I've had the opportunity to visit some of those Howard students in the last couple of months. Journalism is still a popular course of study
Major.
or
Yes.
degree for or major for students. And so what does that mean to you?
Well, it's a major ray of hope. Um, Although I'll admit that some of the students are drawn to the more glamour aspects. They want to be anchor, they want to have a show like Oprah, that kind of thing. But still, there are many of them who are focused on the larger role and the impact that one can have on our community um, through journalism. One of my mentees, Ta-Nehisi Coates, is an example
Oh,
of that.
yes.
Okay,
Hmm.
so um, that even as a student, his mind was focused in that direction. It wasn't about being a TV star or being out there as like a celebrity journalist or anything like that. It was about the deep philosophical and moral questions that face the Black community. And so that's why I'm glad to see students still go in that direction, whatever their motivation, because everybody's not going to be Oprah. But uh, everyone has a chance to play a role in keeping our community informed.
People ask me often, how long do you think you'll continue to publish a newspaper? And
Mhm,
just like I'm so happy that you mentioned the informer in your recent book, in the
mhm,
chapter "Not Dead, Just Gone to Another Place."
mhm.
But what is your prognosis of the Black press as far as I mean, I think you've talked about it a little bit, but
Mhm.
we're all trying to figure out how long print will
Yeah.
last.
Well, um, I think there'll always be a need for the printed word because of the permanence. Um, but in terms of disseminating valuable information to the masses of people of color, it's probably going to be more in the electronic format. And so it's important that we do that. But print is important because of its permanence. You know, I can go back at the Moreland Spingarn Center at Howard University, and I can actually, we actually have bound volumes of all the issues of Freedom's Journal. That's that's invaluable.
Priceless.
Okay,
Right, exactly.
and it's a lesson in itself. And so that's one of the things that we want students to learn. That they need to understand the roots of journalistic communication and to see themselves in it. And I mentioned like Ta-Nehisi saw clearly what that is, and there have been a number of others, some less heralded. I've got a former student who's a deputy managing editor of the Los Angeles Times,
Wow.
and they are bringing that to their work and starting to from within to transform these so-called mainstream media. But mainstream media are never going to approach the issues of Black America because that's not what they're designed for.
Well, I want to, since you mentioned Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Research Center, give them a shout out because they did just get that, I think, $2 million grant
Yes.
to digitize their Black press archives. And a lot of the Black newspapers, including the Washington Informer, are part of that archives. And
Great.
so that we're really excited about that. Dr. Wilson, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I'm just wondering anything that I did not ask you that you wanted to share with us in this last minute or two of our program.
Well, you noted the name of that last chapter about not dead, but just moved to another place. And I should say that other place is a better place. And that when we experience change in our media, remember the white media have undergone many of the same changes for some of the same reasons. The cost of newsprint has gone up tremendously. The cost of labor, cost of distribution, every aspect has we're facing rising costs everywhere. But the essence is we have to address the common good of our people, and our people will support us as long as we're working for them. And I might say in conjunction with the church, because that's where the essence of our community is. That's the spiritual essence of communication among Black people.
And lastly, do we have any more books coming out of the off the desk of Dr. Clint Wilson?
Perhaps. Maybe we might even move into some video things, but we will see.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Dr. Wilson, thank you so very much for being with us as we celebrate this 195th anniversary of the Black press. And thank you for all you've done to make sure that our story of the Black press continues to be told. So
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. Enjoy.
All righty. Thank you. Have a good one.